He is John Carlton, the very famous John Carlton of the Carlton Law Firm here in Austin. John has been at many conferences and workshops that safety has put on. If you've come to anything we've done, you've probably, in the last, how old are we now? 16, 17 years old? If you've come to anything we've done, you've probably seen John at some point. He is an expert on ESD law. I can say that, right? You're an expert on ESD law?
You can say that.
Okay. He serves as safety's legislative counsel. That means during the regular session of the legislature, which just ended, John was very, very busy. He'll be busy again when the legislature begins its very special session next week. So he's here to tell us about what happened and what may happen in the future. We have a lot of information to cover, so please take it away, John.
And I noticed tonight, Clay, that you changed the protocol for how people get their password for their credit, so that it's at some point during the broadcast. But I'd like to point out that for me that means I must be really boring if you're having to bribe people to stay through the entire presentation. So, you know, just pointing that out.
I didn't say anything.
Okay. Well, hello everybody. Good to see you. Sort of. I want to go through a presentation on what happened at the legislature, although we don't really know what happened at the legislature because we have a special session coming up. And so I've got a lot of material to cover. As Cliff Avery pointed out to me, I have 57 slides to move you through. So we'll be moving rather quickly, but if you have questions, please don't hesitate to either fax or text or email them in. We'll be happy to try and answer them. So our legislative update, the session ended on May 29th with sine die. The 20th day following the session on June 18th was the last day for the governor to either sign or veto bills that were passed during the regular legislative session. He had 6,631 bills to watch go through the legislative process. Only 1,211 of them passed, and 50 of those were vetoed. Compare that to the 6,000 incline of additional bills every year or every biennium. There were also 169 joint resolutions proposed to amend the Constitution. Only 9 of those passed. Coming up, yesterday was in fact the first day, based on the governor's proclamation, that bills could be filed for the first special session of the 85th legislature. There were 71 bills filed as of 10 a.m. this morning. That special session begins next Tuesday, a week from today. The special session is primarily, or is being kicked off as a result of a governor's proclamation to extend the existence of several state agencies. Their legislation wasn't passed during the regular session, and so his priority number one is to get those agencies passed and operational again. Otherwise, they would expire as of September 1st of this year. That same proclamation, however, kind of hints at what's to come for this special session, which is that the governor intends to add additional items to the call as soon as running. Now, there's been some debate about what that means, passage of those bills, whether that means they're on his desk or through one house or two houses. I'm not sure, but we'll see how that goes. The supplemental proclamation, there's a draft of it out there already, which the governor's office has provided. That supplemental proclamation is intended to advise people of what he's going to add to the special session. There are a number of topics. This is the way the governor kind of sets his priorities. He's the only one that gets to decide what happens during the special session. There's a number of things related to schools. There are a couple of things related to property taxes, most importantly. We'll talk a little bit about what happened during regular session, but what's to come during special session. But there will be legislation reforming the laws governing ad valorem property taxes. In addition, there's a few other things with respect to scheduling of Sunset Commission and some other issues. I'm kind of skipping through to the ones that are going to be important for emergency service districts and local government. These two items on this slide One is legislation using population growth and inflation to establish a spending limit for state government. Now, that is for state agencies. It doesn't affect local government. However, there is a similar item on the call for using those same factors to establish spending limits for political subdivisions. And our conversations with the governor's office several weeks ago, they weren't able to specifically give us any calculations for how those caps would be put in place. And honestly, I haven't seen any legislation filed that would affect that, but we are going to be concerned about it coming forward in the special session. Two other items that are significant for us. One is the governor would like legislation that protects private property rights from political subdivision rules. Now, that comes into play for our ESDs with respect to fire code enforcement and rules regarding compliance with fire code. Second is if you do have to get a permit from a local government entity, he wants legislation passed that would expedite the processing of those permits for property owners. In addition, he wants to prohibit political subdivisions from imposing new rules, but he wants that prohibition and that determination of when a new rule is to be based on the time the property was acquired by an individual. There are current laws already in place about grandfathering of regulations, but this would be a departure from those and probably push the time frame back with respect to that grandfathering. He also wants to continue with the push to reform municipal annexation. It ended up in the regular session, but we look to have that come forward in the special session as well. We've already had some conversations with a few members about that particular piece. Now, there'll be some other legislation that he wants to push forward regarding handheld mobile communication devices as far as preempting local regulations. And then the bathroom bill, essentially, is what this legislation regarding use of multi-occupancy showers, locker rooms, restrooms, and changing rooms is. He wants to continue to pursue that to get more than what was passed during regular session. And then this is a huge laundry list. So these are the items that would come in to the session. Prohibiting state or local government from reducing or deducting labor, union, and employee organization membership fees from their wages, and prohibiting financial transactions between a local government or a government entity and abortion providers, restricting health plans and health benefits plans for abortions, and then legislation strengthening laws applicable to abortions and abortion complications to the Department of State Health Services. The governor, also wants to push legislation enhancing patient protections for DNRs, do not resuscitate orders, and then also legislation regarding ballot fraud, mail-in ballot fraud particularly. Now, all of that huge list of items has to be completed by August the 17th. That's the length of the special session. If that's not completed, the governor will be faced with a choice. Does he call another special session to address those issues, or does he let them go? Essentially, that list of issues is the governor's platform. Those are the things that he believes are important enough to bring the whole legislature back into session. It doesn't match up exactly with the lieutenant governor's list that we saw going into session about his priorities. And so I think this is the governor trying to assert his opinion on the policy of the state and get the legislature to push those ideas that he wants them to enact. Now, interestingly, the Monday, August 28th, after special session ends, is also the 91st day after the regular session, which is when bills that didn't have an effective date would go into place, unless they had some other effective date specified in the law. Let's talk a little bit about those issues that came up during the regular session. The governor had some emergency items. That's how he gets to dictate the items that are important to him during regular session. Those emergency items were ethics reform. There were 3 bills passed regarding that. There were a number of bills that did not pass. The Child Protective Services restructuring, CPS, House Bill 5, and several others that modified how Child Protective Services works in the state passed. The Sanctuary Cities Bill, SB 4, which also passed. and then a convention of states. So there were 2 joint resolutions and a Senate bill passed with respect to how the convention of states was desired by the state of Texas, and that would result in potentially a conversation if enough states pass a convention of states resolution to bring us to some constitutional amendments at the federal level. Now, I mentioned earlier, after going through the governor's list, the lieutenant governor's issues. As we talked about before, the lieutenant governor had a laundry list of issues that were important to him. Number 1 was that comprehensive property tax reform, which is why we're going to see it again in special session. He and the governor aren't exactly eye to eye on how that's going to work, but the governor wants something more than what the House took action on, I believe. You'll notice that list follows some of the governor's items, but not in every way. There were some other issues during regular session that we tracked, one of which was municipal annexation. We were heavily involved in that reform, and we also monitored some of the gun control or concealed carry legislation that was passed. Now, our legislative agenda. Well, our legislative agenda, you may recall, was developed back in September of 2017. We had 50 people from across the state, divided into caucus groups, and came up with this list of 5 issues that were really important for members of the association. Municipal issues, sales tax, service provider, property tax, and government transparency. Now, during the session, our legislative committee from the board helped guide me in our approach down at the Capitol. That committee is composed of Scott Morgan, who's the president, Liz Cargile was the vice chair, also a past president, Jim Carter from North Texas, Paula Barr from Central Texas, and Bob Janusitis from the Houston and Southeast Texas area. Our agenda involved several key items. 1, protection of ESD funding. In order to do that, we had to work to oppose any limitations on exceeding the effective tax rate or changes in the rollback rate. Essentially, we worked hand in hand with folks from the Texas Municipal League, the Texas Association of Counties, and other county representative organizations. And the result was there were no changes to the rollback rate or the effective rate during the regular session. However, that issue is coming back during special session, and that's going to be one of the things we're really focused on during the next 30 to 45 days. We also were concerned about changes to the state sales tax model and how that was going to happen, wanting to make sure that sales tax stayed in place as an available funding source for ESDs. There were no changes and no elimination of sales tax for ESDs. There was a bill that was passed to bring a single election for varied levels of sales tax within an ESD, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but no sales tax elimination for ESDs. With respect to those city issues, this really is kind of where municipal annexation came into play. We wanted to protect ESDs from being removed, from having cities remove themselves. We wanted to protect ESDs from annexation impacts by cities. And we wanted to make sure we maintain the ability to have good relationships with our cities. Now, I'll talk later about the annexation bill that moved through both the House and the Senate. But that issue is going to come back up and be debated during the special session. As we talked about sales tax revenue protection, there weren't any changes on that. We were concerned about employee and union issues. Didn't really have any substantial changes with respect to how ESDs have to deal with their employees or their firefighters and unions. There was a bill passed that clarified some ESD commissioner practices for how to appoint commissioners in East Texas. And then there weren't really any other changes, although there was a bill filed that we'll talk about that would have proposed election for most of the larger population county ESDs. And then there were some bills related to first responders and how they could, whether or not they could carry a concealed handgun and those kind of things. The only bill that passed in that front was House Bill 435. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So, significant legislation for ESDs. Well, number one throughout the entire session was started out with Senate Bill 2 by Senator Betancourt out of the Harris County area. That bill did not pass the House. It did pass the Senate, and it passed the Senate relatively quickly, but it stalled in the House. And it stalled in the House because it would have reduced the rollback rate below the 8%, and it would have forced an election on rollback rate. and the House was unwilling to accept those changes. In addition, the bill had some changes in the timeline for how you would have had to have adopt your taxes, and it would have changed some of the appraisal district review board and oversight and procedures. The House actually ended up accepting many of the appraisal review process reform in what was Senate Bill 669 by Senator Nelson out of North Texas. But the House did not include in that bill any of the rollback rate or election changes, and consequently, when that bill went over to the Senate wouldn't accept the House changes. So the whole issue was left on the table, which is why it's back in the call for the special session. We will see. There will be, I think, a fight between the House and its membership not wanting to restrict the local government ability to fund services versus the Senate's the large majority of the Senate's staunch opposition to any sort of increase in taxes without an election. We'll see how that goes. I expect that to be a difficult fight again. Now, I've talked a little bit, and I'm going to move through some of these slides pretty quickly, but you'll have a chance to see the presentation later. But Senate Bill 669 ended up with this reform to the appraisal process, and I've got some bullet points here over what that included. But I want to get on to some other things for us to talk about with respect to the bills during regular session and during special session instead of having you look through this list with me. I want to, in particular, get to municipal annexation. And at the beginning of the regular session, Representative Larson of the San Antonio area filed House Bill 299, which was an extensive rewrite of the state annexation laws. Now, that bill didn't end up being the vehicle, but a very similar bill did, and that was Senate Bill 715. So Donna Campbell from the corridor between San Antonio and Austin filed Senate Bill 715. Now that bill was very close to passing. And if you recall, we talked before about Representative Huberty's bill from the 2015 session, which died on the House floor on third reading. Well, this time Senate Bill 715 died at a filibuster at midnight on May 28th, the next to last day of the session in the Senate. Now that bill was very, very close to passing, but she couldn't bring it up and get enough votes to pass it until it was too late. And that meant that there was opposition, and the opposition had the ability to filibuster the bill, which killed everything behind it in the Senate calendar. That bill was very similar to House Bill 299, and it was in fact amended on the House side in order to make those bills similar with respect to process. It removed limited purpose annexation except for water districts. It would have required a petition or more than 50% of the voters and landowners to annex an area with fewer than 200. Essentially, it's an election requirement for small annexation areas. And it would have actually required an election for any area that had more than 200 residents. And then it would have also, in addition to that election, required consent of more than 50% of the landowners in case those residents weren't more than 50% of the landowners. It also would have required that cities actually annex limited purpose annexation areas at the end of the limited purpose plan. Now, the other thing that we worked on in that bill was we inserted a provision that would require that service providers like ESDs, and we weren't specific, it was all sorts of service providers, would get notice of these annexations coming forward. That provision was inserted in the bill, but because the bill died, it was not added into the law. I really expect this to come back during special session in a very similar format. There were a few other things added into that bill, and we'll talk about one of them a little bit later that I don't expect to be in it, but municipal annexation reform is on the table for special session. Now, two interesting bills that were that were companions, House Bill 2596 and Senate Bill 655 by Representative Larson and Senator Betancourt. Neither one passed, but they may come back in special session. I'm not really sure. They required notice of the extent of a municipality or its ETJ to be out there in the record so that people could actually find out where the city limit boundaries were and where the ETJ boundaries. That information is not readily available. That bill would have required it to be more available to the public, and I expect that to come back. Now, legislation affecting municipal annexation, Senator Menendez did pass a bill that extended some of the provisions on ESD annexation that applied to the Austin annexations to San Antonio. Now that bill passed. It becomes effective September 1 of 2017. So if you're in Bexar County or in a surrounding county and San Antonio is annexing into your area, as of September 1st, they're going to have some additional hurdles to jump through. With respect to sales tax, one of the bills that was out there moving through was House Bill 1370 by Representative Drew Springer. Now, Representative Springer doesn't have any ESDs in his area, but he's a volunteer firefighter, has a good connection with the volunteer firefighting community. His bill would have allowed smaller cities and ESDs, smaller sales taxing entities, access to more detailed information about sales tax generators in their area. Now, there was some debate with the folks who pay sales taxes, the businesses that do, about whether that was good information. They're worried about competition with other sales outlets. That bill ultimately died on the House floor without a vote because of that conflict. I don't see it coming back this session, but it may come back next session if there's some negotiation that can be made and things that can be worked out about how we can gain access to that additional information. Those of us that collect sales tax, that information would be really helpful in terms of planning and knowing what our revenues are going to be or what the addition of a store or the loss of a store may mean in our area. The other bill that I want to point out related to sales tax is Senate Bill 1727 by Senator Birdwell. Now, this was a bill that changes somewhat the procedure for ESDs to implement sales tax. You all may know that the Comptroller's Office has in the past held that we have to have serial elections to impose sales tax at different rates. This bill alters that process specifically and says that an ESD can have a sales tax in one election at one time to adopt sales taxes of different rates in different areas within the district, which allows you then to have an election and take up all of the available sales tax within your area, regardless of how many other entities have different levels of sales tax. That bill became effective June 9th. We'll be curious to see how it changes elections. One significant thing it does is it requires everybody in the district to vote on those elections. So even if you may have sales tax areas that are excluded from your sales tax, those folks would vote on it so that all your voters within your district will be involved in the election process. Now, open government. Senate Bill 625 by Senator Kolkhorst. She was a little bit on the warpath about transparency and access to financial data. She passed this bill which requires the Comptroller to create a database of special districts. And each special purpose district has to submit particular items to the Comptroller. It's really similar to what we've been submitting to the Department of Agriculture, but with a few other things. So I'm sure we'll be able to work through the process of helping you get this information to the Comptroller. It becomes effective September 1st of this year. There are some provisions about any district that fails to comply with submitting the data gets placed on a non-compliance list and is potentially subject to some penalties. So we'll help walk you through that as we get towards the implementation of it by the Comptroller. I don't expect the Comptroller to come out with immediate implementation, but we'll be watching their rulemaking and their processes and let you know about how that happens. There was a little bit of legislation affecting Emergency Service District employees. House Bill 2685 by Armando Martinez would have placed ESDs in the same field as municipalities with respect to employee laws, in particular civil service. That bill died in committee. It never even got heard in committee. And so it never made it to calendars, never made it to the floor. It would have imposed a laundry list of items on ESDs who have paid firefighter employees. And we opposed that bill because it would have increased our costs of providing service. And with our 10-cent constitutional cap, any bill that imposes additional costs on us is a problem because we're already trying to make ends meet with what we have. The list of the things that it would have required is in here. It refers, actually the bill refers to several provisions in the local government code related to civil service for firefighters, but I've just provided the list to you to be able to review. Now, there was another bill, House Bill 2351 by Pancho Nevarez, which related to investigation of firefighters. This was an issue that kind of came out of his district. That bill actually went through the committee hearing process and was amended to remove its impact on ESDs and make it only impact municipalities, but it died on the House floor because it was withdrawn from the local calendar, which meant there was a member that was willing to stand up and talk for more than 10 minutes to kill the bill. That bill may or may not come back in a future session, but it did not pass. Now, this is gun control legislation affecting ESD volunteers, House Bill 435 by Representative Ken King. This bill defines volunteer emergency services personnel. And we're talking about volunteer personnel, not paid personnel. The bill provides that if a volunteer who meets that definition is carrying a concealed handgun with a valid license while providing services, emergency services, that the volunteer is exempt from some of the prohibitions on where they can carry their concealed handgun. But in addition, it states that the governmental entity, the ESD in this case, is not liable for the actions, for any civil action against the district for the actions of the volunteer. Now, the other thing it clearly states is that if a volunteer is concealed carrying a handgun while providing emergency services, that is out, and they use that weapon during that time, that is outside the course and scope. That's of their duties as an emergency services provider. Now, that's kind of language legally that would basically say that they're acting without insurance from the ESD or whoever their volunteer organization is. The ESD can't be liable for that. And so this bill really attempts to allow those volunteers to carry, but it does not, and it also, as a result, then tries to carve out any liability for the ESD or the service provider itself. Now, they have to be engaged in providing emergency services to gain this access to the liability protections. The bill does not require ESDs to allow their volunteers to carry while providing services. There is nothing in the bill about that. I agree, TML's got some positions on this as well, and they're telling their member cities that they do not have to allow concealed carry for their volunteers. This bill does not apply to paid personnel, so you don't have to allow paid personnel. And any paid personnel that would be carrying don't get access to this exemption the way the volunteers would under the bill. So it'd be interesting to see how this rolls out and how it impacts operations as we go forward, but I want to bring that bill to your attention. Now let's talk about just a few other issues. There was Senate Bill 241 by Senator Coney Burton. She wanted to prohibit or relating to the use of public money by a political subdivision for lobbying. It actually never got heard in committee. She's filed that bill, I think, every session she's been in office, but the bill hasn't ever moved forward. I think the legislature is well aware that political subdivisions with volunteer board members need help in getting their positions heard down at the Capitol during session, and that you all can't just drop your jobs and come down for weeks on end while the legislature debates topics. So let's go to legislation that affects Chapter 775. Representative Eddie Rodriguez out of Travis County filed House Bill 3074. That bill was an effort to address an annexation compensation issue that arose in that district, in a district in Travis County. The bill was heard in committee, but didn't have time to get set on the House calendar, and essentially the bill couldn't get a hearing in committee in time to get on the House calendar. It was added, however, into the House amendments for Senate Bill 715, which was the annexation bill. But that bill died on the Senate floor when it went back over. It may be back in special session, the topic might be, and I'm not sure whether Representative Rodriguez will refile it, but it may come up in some form. I don't believe we're going to see it in the overall annexation reform bill, but it's possible. So we'll keep an eye out for that particular change. Then Senate Bill 1563 by Senator Kolkhorst, which would have changed the audit requirements for ESDs. I'm not sure what the genesis of this concern was on her part, but it was sort of some minor tinkering in what the audit process was. The bill was never heard in committee. I don't believe it was heard because I don't think a committee hearing was ever requested. So we may or may not see that back in the future, but we're already required to have audits. There's already procedures for that, but we'll continue to work with Senator Kolkhorst on those issues. Representative James White, who's been a really hard-working representative for the ESDs in his district and has been really cooperative with our association and helped us advance the interest of ESDs, got passed a bill that cleaned up some problems that occurred with the Village Mills ESD, which is in Tyler and Hardin counties. When Chapter 776 was in place many years ago, there was a provision that allowed that particular ESD to have its commissioners appointed instead of elected. This bill was passed and cleaned up, so it clarifies that appointment is possible there. That bill became effective immediately on May 29th. Excuse me. Then Representative Chairman Coleman authored House Bill 2211, which would have clarified some issues with respect to qualifications to be an ESD commissioner in Harris County. That bill never got heard in committee. It was added into, however, what we call the County Omnibus Bill, which was House Bill 4180. But when that bill went to the Senate, it was removed in the Senate. And it was removed because the senator handling the bill didn't want any legislation in the bill that hadn't already passed the House. She didn't want to create a legislative pathway for something that hadn't gone through the entire process. So that bill may come up in the future, but it died when the House did not concur in the Senate amendments to 4180 because Chairman Coleman didn't like some of the things that the Senate put in his bill. So Representative Jason Isaac authored House Bill 1510, which initially proposed to move oversight of emergency service districts from the Department of Agriculture to the Texas Commission on Fire Protection and the Department of State Health Services. That bill was amended through the process, and Representative Isaac worked with us to find the right place for ESDs. And we believe we did that. It passed as amended. And as a consequence, now the Division of Emergency Management, which is part of the Department of Public Safety, is now where ESDs will report effective September 1st. So safety is working with the Division of Emergency Management, the Division of Emergency Management to get that reporting in place and hopefully get some more help from the state with respect to how ESDs function and maybe an advocate for the funding needs for emergency services. Representative Isaac also proposed House Bill 1509, which, as I mentioned briefly earlier, would have required elections for most ESD commissioners in the state. That bill, however, was never heard in committee, and I think as a result of much of the effort of ESD commissioners who are constituents of Representative Isaac in his area, I think he began to understand some of the challenges of elections for ESD commissioners versus appointment. And ultimately, he chose not to pursue that bill. Now, the information about what's going on at the Capitol can be found at the Capitol website, which is on the screen now. The really critical thing that I think we have going forward is that special session starts in 7 days. There will be more than the 71 bills that have currently been filed. Those 71 bills are just the tip of the iceberg. And really the current thought is that the governor will in fact add the additional items to the call once these state agencies are reenacted and refunded. Once those items are added to the call, then the houses can begin to take up the bills that have been filed. I haven't seen an annexation bill filed yet. The property tax reform bills haven't been filed yet. It's interesting when you look at the list of what has been filed, how in the House, bill numbers 1 through 40 are all reserved. The very first bill that was filed was 41. And I'm sure there are reserve numbers in the Senate as well. So I'll be curious to see how those bills get filed over the next week. Because once the session starts, there's very little time to move things. We had months during regular session. But during regular session, there were some really key senators and representatives, in particular with the area of property tax reform. That's where I think the biggest debate is going to be, at least from a local government perspective, during the special session. You have senators from rural areas of Texas that know that funding in their areas is really tight, that their local governments need flexibility to provide services. Senators like Senator Robert Nichols from East Texas, Lois Kolkhorst from the Texas coast between the urban areas, Senator Perry, Senator Sellier from West Texas. Senator Sellier, in fact, voted against the Republican platform for these property tax rollback changes and elections. And then Senator Craig Estes from the rural part of North Texas, north and west of the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Those senators really, although they're Republican and although they are opposed to property tax increase, they really had a hard time with, I think, the platform of the lieutenant governor and what we assume may be the platform of the governor, because they know that local government needs flexibility and that some of the smaller entities like ESDs and small counties and small cities need to be able to increase taxes a reasonable amount without incurring additional costs. Senator Buckingham was a first-term senator out of Travis County and some of the rural areas west of Travis County. I'd put her in that group as well. For our ESD members, contacting these senators is critical. You need to let them know what the impact of the proposed property tax reform in Senate Bill 2 would have done to the ESDs. I've been very careful to explain that it's not a cap. I agree, it's not a cap. It doesn't say you have a maximum tax rate. We already have that at 10 cents. But it does impose additional costs on ESDs to try and raise your tax rate. And it does that by requiring an election if you go in excess of your rollback rate at all. And it makes those costs happen sooner by reducing the rollback rate. Both of those things pull at our resources and take them away from the other emergency services we're there to provide. I've also tried to explain to the various members that I've spoken with, we're a little bit unique. We provide emergency services. We don't get the discretion to choose to provide other things. I mean, it's pretty much public safety for us, and that's what we get to spend our dollars on. We don't have any what I would consider to be inappropriate expenses for things that government shouldn't be paying for. Now, on the House side, the House was obviously opposed to those changes or those reforms to rollback rate and election. But still there's going to be pressure in the House because of the governor putting this item back on the call. Representative Springer, whom I mentioned, although he doesn't have any ESDs, he understands rural Texas and understands the costs that will be imposed by these changes. Representative Stevenson, Representative Shine, Representative Muir, Representative Johnson, Representative Drew Darby, James White, Richard Raymond are all Republicans and members of the House that need to hear from you about your opposition to any increase in costs for how you go about providing your services and how that's going to impact you. Now, on the House side, there's a whole laundry list of people who supported the bill that was passed. So I'm going to suggest to you that you contact your House member, regardless of who it is, and say thank you for not passing property tax rollback and rollback election changes. They need to know that there's support out there. There is a movement certainly to support putting rollback changes in place. But they need to know, these folks who've gone out on a limb to try and not have drastic and dramatic changes that would impact our cost of providing service, those folks need to know that you appreciate the stance they're taking. The same would be true for any other issue that came up during the regular session that's going to be on this special session agenda, primarily municipal annexation reform. I think it's worthwhile to contact Representative Larson, Senator Campbell, and the others who were actively working on annexation reform. Those things potentially can benefit our emergency service districts as long as we continue to be in the conversation for how annexation may impact us. So we have a really short window. Special session doesn't occur very often, and there'll be a lot happening, but contacting your representative or your senator is important right now so that they hear your voice before this 30-day cycle starts. So we've got a week to go. There's a lot going to happen before we get there, and I'm hoping we've got questions for folks.
We've got a couple. Real quickly, before we get to that, I do want to say we've been contacted by a couple folks who had technical difficulties. I've checked with a couple other people who I knew were watching, and they were okay. So not sure what's going on. We tried to fix the problem in a number of ways, but there will be a recording of this posted to the website, and if you contact us and you had some technical difficulties, you maybe missed some of the webcast to this point, we'll be sure to get you that, and we'll work out the whole credit situation too there. And if you can't see me right now because you had technical difficulties, then this message doesn't help you very much. But there will be a recording, and we will do our best to make sure everybody gets satisfied for the webcast and the credit. Now, I do want to put out one last call. We don't have a lot of time, but if you do have questions, please get them in to us here at 512-251-8101. You can just call in that number. That's a safety line, and you can just tell us your question. Email us at safed@texas.net. Texas is spelled out. That's the safety email address. Many of you know it. You can text me right here. Many of you have been already, mostly about your technical issues. You can text us at 512-567-0857. Normal text messaging rates apply there, and you can even fax us at 512-251-8152. Let's just go straight to it. We had one question, and it's a little confusing. Did safety have input into House Bill 93? I wasn't familiar with that one.
I don't believe that we tracked House Bill 93, although and I'll confess, my list of bills we were tracking was about 250, and so I don't have them all memorized.
I looked it up, and it was relating to, I mean, it was kind of a vague caption relating to divorce on grounds of insupportability. I'm not sure. Not sure if the numbers right there that the questioner was asking, or if there was something in it. I don't remember 93.
You know, if they'll text back and say on the bill relating to whatever the subject was, right, that'll prompt, and maybe we can get you an answer. Not ringing a bell.
Okay, let's try this one. What do you think about sending out a pre-addressed stamped return envelope with a petition to gather signatures? This is sort of a not legislative question, I think. But let's give it a shot anyway. What do you think about sending out a pre-addressed stamped return envelope with a petition to gather signatures from ESD residents calling for a sales tax increase election for an ESD? That's pretty fact-specific. Consult your attorney.
Pretty fact-specific. Yeah, I'd say consult your attorney. I will note this. I'm not aware of an ESD sales tax election that's been called as a result of a petition. I think all of them have been just the decision of the board. I could be wrong.
A petition to gather signatures from ESD residents calling for a sales tax increase election. Yep. Well, that's not something I've ever heard of doing.
It's possible. The law allows folks to petition for that kind of an election, but to my knowledge, I believe all the sales tax elections for ESDs in the state to date have been called by the boards without the need for a petition. Let's
review real quickly what we have. That the bill that did pass, I'm blanking right now.
Senate Bill 1727.
The one about sales tax reform,
right.
The election reform.
Right.
So, just to be clear, you no longer have to go back, right?
Well,
still confuses me. So if it confuses me,
the comptroller's interpretation of the law as it existed prior to this bill passing was that if you had available sales tax in your area, and say you had a city that took up a penny of sales tax in your ESD as well, that you had to have an election for the penny for the area where the city was, and then you had to have a separate election for the other penny that was available outside. Right. In other words, you had to stagger your elections. It's possible, given that counties have half-cent sales tax, library districts have half-cent sales tax, municipalities have penny sales tax, they also have economic development sales tax of anywhere from an eighth to a full penny or a half cent, that you would have had to have had 3 or 4 elections to take up all of the available sales tax. Now, there's some ESDs
at different levels.
Right, at different levels. There's some ESDs that are fortunate, don't have any of those competing sales tax interests within their area. They could have one election and get the whole 2 cents. Mm-hmm. But the law, as the comptroller was requiring, it was requiring staggered elections in order to take up all of this. The bill clarifies now that you can have an election, and the election will say, your proposition would say, you can adopt a sales tax up to this amount in the entire district. And then when you implement it, you carve out those areas. So it's not the election that has to carve out the areas, it's the implementation. So the comptroller is essentially directed to accept the results of an election. We want sales tax up to 2 cents in our entire ESD. And if the people vote for that, then the comptroller has to now figure out how they're going to collect in the different areas with the different levels, as opposed to requiring an ESD to have multiple expensive elections to do that very same thing.
So is the carve-out election still a thing? For instance, if a municipality is at 2 cents already, can you carve them out?
So the municipality is going to be carved out of the impact of the election, but the election, I believe, now is going to have to be a district-wide election. But the municipality, and let me be very clear, if there's an area that's already got sales tax, it's not going to be impacted by that sales tax in that area is not going to be impacted by this election.
Right. What do you think the governor's top priority for the special session is?
It's hard to tell, given the, I don't know, say 19 or 20 items that are on in his proclamation. I think his number one priority is the state agencies, which is why he's characterized the special session the way he has, with, first enable these agencies and then we'll go on and talk about the other issues. I don't believe that his list is necessarily a priority in order of priority list. I haven't heard that. It's possible. Lieutenant Governor Patrick's priorities were as he had listed them before the regular session. So I wish I could tell you, but I just don't know. I suspect property tax reform is up there of some sort. Whether his priority is that it include rollback rate change and rollback election change, I don't know. I don't know whether that's a priority for him or not. And municipal annexation reform, I think, is important to him, but I don't know where it falls with respect to the other issues.
Okay. Real quickly, before we get to the credit part of this whole thing, can you tell them out there in the ESD world what's the most important thing they can do during the special session to be involved?
The most important thing you can do, I would say, is actually contact your representative and senator before special session, because special session is going to be a condensed version of session. And they're going to have very little time to really listen and deal with any substantive conversations. Now's the time to have those conversations, and the window's closing quickly. But during session, to the extent you're paying attention to particular bills, and I'll attempt to have the list of stuff that's been filed up as quickly as we can get it. To the extent you have input on bills, you need to be contacting your representative or your senator, which is what I always advise folks to be doing, regardless of whether they're in the legislature's in session or not.
Okay, well, let's get to how you get to credit, shall we? Thank you so much,
sure.
John.
Well, surprisingly enough, it's at the end of the program.
Yeah, surprise, it's at the end of the program. As I said, we will be having a recording up for technical issues to make sure that everyone can see the full webcast as we go forward. So we will we will go ahead and get that up and get you a link there quickly. But for now, let's get to how to apply for your 1 hour of credit from the webcast. Go to the website, www.safe-d.org/webcast1707r8.pdf. You must enter the keyword there, relapse. No .pdf. No, don't listen to me. Look at here. Look at the thing. It's just 1707R8 is the end of that URL. It is not a PDF. Once again, we'll try this again, and I'll do it right this time, I promise. www.safe-d.org/